Okay, we're going over the introductory paragraph. What would score a point? So again, sorry I forgot to hit record for all the people tuning in that you're probably not even tuning in because you don't care, but that's okay. All right, so let's start with after World War II, 1945. This student is kind of a different direction. She's saying like, hey, look at what all is going on in the United States during the same years as the Cold War, but has nothing to do with the Cold War. Okay, that does provide context. Soldiers are coming home and they're building their houses and they're starting their families. They're going to college because of the GI Bill. And she's setting the scene. Okay, that's one way you could score it. If she stopped here and then went into her thesis statement, it would technically score the point. It wouldn't be the best like flow, but remember, APUSH is not about style. APUSH is about facts, okay? What most students did, I would say, and what I think is the easiest way to earn this point is the next part. How about we just like explain what the Cold War was, right? After World War II, you had the Soviet Union's desire to expand communism. It's gonna, let's see, across the globe. It fueled conflict between the United States and talk about like democracy versus communism. Even if you explain those things, it would be awesome. If you could SFI wise, like, cause I would kind of want a piece of SFI there, like you could reference, you know, the Yalta Conference, or you could reference, I had one student that did a really good job and it was enough where they talked about how Stalin, they used Stalin, that would count as SFI, held a grudge against the United States about the deaths, right, towards the end of World War II, and that was something that helped fuel it. That is, I think, the easiest way to earn the contextualization point. How are we doing so far? Yeah, is that helpful? Does anyone have any questions about anything so far? Okay, so no questions about contextualization. We're here for the thesis statement. Yeah, okay, so the thesis is obviously very important. It is the structure of your entire essay. I think a lot of kids on the DBQ, because we were worried about, especially our first timed one, we were worried about running out of time. And I could tell from in the classroom, at least, that a lot of kids didn't really plan all that much. They just went straight to writing, okay? And you might have done that at home as well. And that's why we practice the timed part, because hopefully now you realize like, ooh, maybe I should spend a little bit more time planning it out and coming up with a good thesis statement. Now, first things first, it has to respond to the prompt. What is the question asking? If you need to rewrite the prompts in a way that makes you understand what the historical thinking skill is, so causation, comparison, continuity, and change over time, okay? If you need to rewrite it in some way or kind of break it down in some way that simplifies it, you can totally do that, okay? It has to respond to the prompt. So for the Cold War DBQ, you had to show how the Cold War affected American society, causation, okay? And some others here in a second, I'll show you as well, like how we're gonna do that. Now it has to be historically defensible, all right? What that means is you can't just write some bullcrap opinion that you might have, okay? Like it actually has to be able to be defended with historical facts. Now for the DBQ, that can get difficult because remember, you have to use the documents to defend it. So if you, let's say that you wanted to talk about, this is kind of hard, but like, what if you make an argument, a thesis that has nothing to do with any of the documents? Okay. Yes, Will, we're going to do some. I'm just trying to explain it real quick. Okay. So what if you make some argument that has nothing to do with civil liberties, nothing to do with economic growth, that has nothing to do with the Red Scare, and you just make some like far-fetched claim, you're not going to get the points. Say, for the LEQ, you have a little bit more freedom, okay? Now, the most difficult part is this part right here, where it says establishes a line of reasoning. Raise your hand if that confuses the crap out of you. When Ms. Cruz says it doesn't establish a line of reasoning. Possibly, yeah, okay. Meaning that your thesis statement you can't just say that the Cold War impacted American society politically, economic, socially, or it impacted American society through division, or it impacted American society by growing the economy.
So are you just talking about like how specific it is?
How specific it is. It has to be, how did it grow the American economy, right? Or, what type of division? What was the division about? So almost like ask yourself that question. Can I be like one step more? It's the Goldilocks effect, right? You don't be too broad. You don't really be like super specific where you have this huge long thesis statement that's confusing for the AP readers. You need to find the sweet spot, which makes it so difficult. And like some of you guys too, because of AP Lang, you're like trying to be super complicated, and it does not have to be that way. Now, some of you, that's a natural way that you write and you can do it. And you know the history to where you can write this eloquent, complicated thesis statement. And that's totally fine. But for the vast majority of us, we're not going to be able to do that with the time that we've been given in this year. It's just not going to happen. So like, for example, with this thesis statement, okay, the Cold War had a positive effect. So positive, that word positive, that shows a line of reasoning. You don't have to have that in a thesis statement, but that is an example of how you can earn it. The Cold War had a positive impact on the American economy due to the growth in defense industries. So there are multiple documents that you could have used to support that claim. So that's subclaim 1. However, the government's Cold War policies negatively impacted American society due to the rise in anti-communist hysteria. So that would be the second claim. But do you see where we're saying now like a line of reasoning? So like if you were to take out the line of reasoning, you would say the Cold War had a positive effect on the American economy. However, it negatively impacted society. I don't even know how you would do that one. You know what I'm saying though. I don't need to try this. But does that make sense? Yeah. Any questions about this? So this would score 2 points. All right, let's practice. Evaluate the extent to which women made significant gains in social and economic equality between the years of 1945 and 1980. So this is right in the time period that we're working with, okay? What is the question? What's the historical thinking skill here, do you think?
Continuity and change over time.
Yep, you could argue that, right? So that there's a turning point in 1945 for women, right? And what they want you to do is they want you to show the changes that happened for women, but in what ways? So make sure we have to respond to the prompt. So that we have to show change, so changes that happened. You can also use this though as like maybe there was something that marked the beginning of that change, right? So it can almost even be a causation essay, as long as it's within these time periods. So you could talk about like the feminist movement being that point in which it, changes things for women. But you have to talk about social equality. So think about evidence that would support social equality for women, and then economic equality for women, which is probably the more difficult one to do. If we were to imagine this is just an LAQ, like there are documents that go with this, but we'll probably do that a little bit later. But so when I see, and this is just like tips for thesis statement, when I see if they give me specific ways that I need to show this, I'm going to automatically think body paragraph 1, social gains for women, body paragraph 2, economic gains for women. Does that make sense to everybody? Same thing with that Cold War GBQ. That's how I would think of this, just to simplify it. Because remember, you do not have to have a 3-body paragraph essay. It can be 2-body paragraphs. Doesn't need to be 1 though. That's not a very strong argument. Okay. So we'll get to the thesis in a second. Let's brainstorm real quickly.
Talk about 1920s, like the passage.
Context, yeah, contextualization.
What was that, the 19th Amendment?
Yeah, so you could talk about the 19th Amendment, which gave women political equality.
Would you talk about the rise of it was like pre-Civil War when women were pushing for more civil rights, but it like lost momentum when Civil War started?
You could even, so you could even go back to, the cult of domesticity, right? Which was that belief that women, their job was in the home, and because that's something that continued all the way through, like even the 1920s, there was that battle between, the fundamentalists, right? If you remember the fundamentalists, who were the really religious groups that were like anti-flapper culture, and like, no, like the women need to be, more modest, and they don't need to be go out partying. Like their job is to be, kind of more Victorian era. So you could even reference cult of domesticity would be the earliest thing that you could, technically Republican motherhood would be, that's like Revolutionary War, review there. Or you could do something more immediate where, actually there's still one more thing that we need to kind of talk about that's more immediate.
All right. So for contextualization, this is all stuff before, or is it also stuff? Okay.
It can be either one. For me, I think what I would hope that you guys would have learned is making connections from period of time to period of time, and that history kind of builds on itself. And like for you to be able to realize like, well, there are lots of things that are going to lead to these changes. Women were fighting for their rights. So you could talk about that antebellum reformer period in the chat. I think also, and we've talked about this before, the world wars, because it's not a coincidence that the feminist movement happened after World War II, right? You don't want to dive too much. It does say like 1945. I think that you could reference World War II and like the factories and things like that, even in your essay, because that would provide context maybe for documents or just in general. But there's no doubt about it that the way that women participated and sacrificed during World War II, that for sure, and went to work, a lot of them didn't want to go back home. And that's what kind of prompted the feminist movement. And you could argue that 1945 was kind of that turning point. I think that they would maybe even give you something like broader here, like maybe like, 1940. That to me, those 5 years would change the essay.
Did you talk about if they extended it to 1940, would you include like Rosie the Riveter and like when they started like getting into the World War II factories?
And honestly, Rosie the Riveter could be SFI for your introductory paragraph, for your contextualization. Yep. Yeah.
So are we just supposed to like choose one of these things and talk about it in our introduction, or like choose multiple?
I would try to choose it kind of depends, right? So, if you're going to talk about the world wars, like you could talk about women in factories and Rosie the Riveter together, and then that should be good. And that kind of like was this turning point, because that's a nice thesis into if you're going to write something about the feminist movement. And then maybe 19th Amendment, flapper culture, World War I would go together. I would kind of do it by like decade almost. Or you could kind of briefly talk about the progression. You could start with I think the cult of domesticity is really important one, because that is what sets the tone for all of these other disagreements about the place of women, right? So, they're still referencing the fact that a woman belongs in the home when they're talking about the 19th Amendment, when they're talking about flapper culture. So you could start out this essay saying, from the 18th century, within the cult of domesticity, the belief was that the woman belongs in the home. However, after the world wars, this begins to change due to women working, in the workplace and feeling like they're, motivated and, included and whatever. And you could kind of make that, and then you could kind of go into your thesis. You don't need to talk about all of it, but if you talk about a couple of these, like, kind of a couple sentences, then that would get you the contextualization point. Good question.
Okay, so things like Title IX and like the civil rights movement and stuff, that would just be in like the body paragraphs.
Those would be body paragraphs. Yep, good.
Okay, so we wouldn't put any of that stuff in there.
I would not, because you want to save that for the meat of your essay, because those things fall within this time period. If you talk about it in your contextualization, you can't double dip. You can't earn the SFI point in the rubric while also using it as your contextualization. Yeah, good question. Does that make sense to everybody? And that's why I like to teach thinking about like almost like thematically, like, okay, what else have we learned about women like in the past, right? How is this built upon in history? Like, what is the progression? Especially if you're going to write this as a continuity or change over time, and then you want to throw in some continuity in there, because that's one of the ways that, and this is getting a little bit more difficult, but as you're thinking about a thesis statement, this essay is about change. They want you to talk about the changes that happened where women gained more social and economic equality. So your complexity, like if you want to go for the unicorn point, either it can be in your thesis statement or you could just like have it somewhere in there, is you could talk about the continuity that women have in regards to equality, whether that be discrimination. Like, I hate it when we say like,
Miss Cruz.
And today, people always say like, and this is much like how it is today, but like literally today, like women still earn, 85 cents to the man's dollar or something like that. Like you could throw that in. It had to be more than that, but you could do that. Yes.
What would you say to like that book, Baby and Childcare? It's published in like 46. So like, would you use that as like a complexity point?
Dr. Spock.
Well, just because it talks about like how like immediately after you talk about the baby boom, so like obviously mothers are more are gonna just be inclined to like stay home because like their husbands have come home, and so like there are just so many children to take care of. It's like,
and so that could be your continuity, right? Is that, and that could be that part, is that there are still women with the baby boom. The whole like media of the 1950s is focused on like, Joan Cleaver, like in the kitchen with her makeup and her dress and like having dinner on the table at 6 o'clock. No doubt about it. That's the continuity. You could say like, yes, some women supported the feminist movement. And for some of you, you're probably like, I don't know how to answer this question, because we're still like, you guys will have that chapter check this week. We haven't got to the feminist movement quite yet. Like it's part of chapter 28, which is why I picked this topic. But you have women like Betty Friedan, who believed in like this kind of like conservative view.
You want to talk about like the 70s and like the sexual revolution?
Yes,
like,
all that is in this for sure. Yeah. The counterculture, you have, the feminine mystique, you have Roe v. Wade, you
Miss
have
Magazine.
Miss Magazine, all of that could be SFI in an essay. Or like, so Anya, you asked in the chat, yeah, if you're doing the digital version, you're not going to have an LEQ, you're going to have a DBQ. I didn't want to give documents and do all that today. So the documents would help guide you in what your argument is going to be. But just for the purpose of looking at a prompt and thinking about how to approach the thesis statement is kind of what, how I'm using that. So you're right. You will not have an LEQ, but you'll have a DBQ that you have to write a thesis for. And this is why I think sometimes the LEQ is easier, because you're not limited by the documents. You can just kind of take off, kind of like what Will was saying, is like sexual revolution, the feminist movement, all of these things. More than likely on a DBQ, it's going to have all of those things for you to help guide you and guide your thesis statement.
Do you want us to like, what about like, so would you want us to like present like continuity over change with like like Employment Act and then like Equal Rights Amendment?
So yes, you could do the Equal Rights Amendment and the fact that it wasn't passed, right? It was not ratified. It was passed, but it was never ratified. So that could be an example of like discrimination. You could technically argue that. But yes, that is an idea. So what you would do, like on an LEQ, is what I would brain dump social, right? What are examples of women getting social equality, right? If you have documents, you would sort your documents into that social equality column, okay? I don't have documents for today, but you could do Roe v. Wade. You could do, I mean, even though the Equal Rights Amendment is not ratified, like that could kind of go on that side. You could look at Title IX. And I know you guys like, I haven't read this yet, but that's why I kind of picked it. But Title IX has to do with like female athletes in sports and a lot of other things, but like promoting equality. And so there would be a couple pieces of SFI that you could use there, right? And then you could look at economic equality, okay? And you could look at the number of women in the workforce, or whatever it might be. Actually, Title IX actually works with economic as well. But that's how you would break down and try to organize a thesis statement. Is that helpful? I hope. You want to look at a different one? Does that, at least hopefully that helps with the contextualization, right? Okay. So let's go. And I think mostly it's going to be hard because this is the time period that we're in and we haven't quite finished reading all that yet. We're assessing tomorrow on that. So next one. This was a DBQ question from a few years ago. I think it was my first year teaching APUSH. Explain the reasons why a new conservatism rose to prominence in the United States between 1960 and 1989. Okay, so this is what we're also doing right now. New conservatism. Do you know what that is yet? Barry Goldwater? This is like the Reagan Revolution coming.
Yeah, but like we haven't learned about Reagan.
We haven't got there.
I know that. But what you have hopefully learned about is the rise of liberalism, right? Great Society, so New Deal, Great Society, civil rights, it's a lot of turbulence. You got the Vietnam War, a lot of protests, the hippies are coming, all of those things are happening, right? And what that's, yeah, go ahead.
Would that be like loss of trust in the government?
Yep, loss of trust in the government during these very liberal years. And what that's going to do is that's going to cause the rise of this new conservative movement, okay? So your years are between 1960 and 1989. So the contextualization for this essay are the things that we've been talking about. So well, I guess, yeah, they for sure are. So if we're going to talk about a shift and a cause in this political pendulum to swing in a more conservative political, way towards the Republican Party, okay, what would we need to talk about before 1960 for our contextualization? What do you think?
I guess like the rise of the civil rights movement started in the 50s.
You could. I would for sure talk about the civil rights movement in the body of the essay. Okay. But what is the essay about? Instead of thinking like, okay, what's just happening in the 1950s? Because I think that's where most kids have been going wrong. What is this essay about? It's about political parties, right? So, go ahead.
So like, okay, never mind. When was Johnson he was in office in the 60s.
In the 60s, for sure, yeah. So you had Kennedy, you had Johnson, but before like 1960. So what I would do is I would describe the two political parties. I would describe the Democratic Party and what their views were, their platform, right? Which is liberal, big government, and what evidence do we have for that? How about the New Deal? Right? Because you don't want to go too much into like Great Society programs, because that's going to be in the meat of your essay. Well, what inspired LBJ? FDR and the New Deal, right? During the Depression, the economy is not so great. Republicans were more what? Their view was more
Individual freedom, like
yeah, like rugged individualism. Not strictly laissez-faire, but kind of laissez-faire-ish. I can never spell laissez-faire. Do you like fair-ish? There we go, fair-ish. When it came to like, they're going to be pro-business, right? And small government. Okay, and they just so happened that they were like in the minority during these years. You could even talk about like the New Deal coalition, okay, which that was how FDR was able to like win over all these votes, because he united working class Midwesterners and the Deep South and religious people like Catholics in different parts of the country. Like he was able to unite everyone because the Great Depression, it kind of like leveled the playing field politically for a lot of people, where they were like, everyone was kind of in the same boat. And he came in, he had these ideas that were a huge turning point politically when looking at the role of the federal government, right? And he set the tone for Democrats from that point on. So if your essay is about Kennedy and civil rights, or Johnson and his Great Society programs, and that big government, right, telling states, that that Black and white children have to go to school together, or that we should be helping poor people with their health care, and their, medical bills. That's big government. And so that's the main cause of why there was this swing. In addition to that, you had the kind of the unrest that's going to be happening with Vietnam and the civil rights movement, the violence, the assassinations. And it got way too overwhelming for a lot of people, and they swung in the opposite direction and left the Democratic Party and joined the Republican Party. But does that make sense how all of this would be? Like, again, if my essay is about how I need to talk about Americans becoming more conservative, I need to talk about why they were liberal to begin with. Does that make sense? I hope. Okay.
So could you first talk about like how like the Republican Party and Herbert Hoover kind of led to the like Great Depression,
Yep, and you could
deal, and then link that to like LBJ, Great Society, or
mm-hmm.
whatever.
Yep. I would do like Hoover's response, and then FDR comes in, and then again this huge shift, because remember FDR begins. And I would even maybe mention that, like, how many decades of liberalism, right? You had Eisenhower in there, but he was kind of moderate, remember? He was good with Social Security. He was good with, welfare, certain welfare programs, because they were popular with the American people at that time. But the turbulence of the 1960s, which is what we'll be talking about in class tomorrow, Friday, and actually even Monday, Tuesday next week, you'll be able to see like why people were so drawn to Ronald Reagan, and why they were so drawn to the Republican Party, because it was such a turbulent time in American history. And it was very easy for people to be like, the reason we are like this today is because of big government, because of liberalism. And that was kind of their justification. Yeah. I think that this question is hard, and it would make more sense like if you got to see the documents. Do you want to see the documents? Okay. I wasn't prepared, sorry. Oh, don't steal my password. It's recorded too. Nobody's watching anymore. Okay. Come on, AP Classroom. Okay, so we had this chart. Okay, so it's looking at unemployment. So we're going to talk about stagflation in the 1970s. That'll also play a role in this. But you can see that the economy was not doing so well in the 1960s and 1970s. Most of that has to do with the fact of the Vietnam War, and then also a decline in a lot of government jobs, actually. Okay.
Yeah, but it got so much worse
Oh,
post.
wait. Why do they
Got it-
have?
It got extremely bad, like with Ford and like.
Oh yeah, I mean we'll talk about all that. But again, remember that we have hindsight now. People living in that period of time didn't know what it's the same thing with Hoover, right? They felt like this was the right way to go about it, but they didn't really know what was the right decision. And FDR didn't either. And you could argue that that was a good thing for America or a bad thing for America long term. But you have Barry Goldwater. He's important, by the way, like he is on this chapter check this week. He was the first person that said, in response to liberalism, what we are doing is setting, because he hates like the whole idea of like the welfare state, and that we're creating people dependent on the welfare system. He was your first guy to talk about that. And Reagan was almost like, he was like a mentor to Ronald Reagan. But Barry Goldwater is doing that as early as 1960. And he talks about how FDR, and what he did is hurting our country. Here you have Friedman, an economist, where he talks about government intervening in the economy. So I think that what you could do for this prompt, already just like refreshing myself, looking at these documents, is think about, well, what would be the reasons why people would want to swing back away from liberalism? It's for economic reasons, and then try to find documents that have to do with the economic reasons. And then maybe like the political ideology of like big government, that's going to be another thing. And so maybe look for documents that are doing that. I always like to do for a thesis statement, when you're with the documents in particular, is I like the columns of social, political, economic, and see where they can go. Obviously, you're not going to say, what was the prompt? New conservatism rose to prominence in the United States because of social, political, and economic reasons. You're going to pick a couple of those, reasons, and try to, again, find that sweet spot, the middle spot, where it's not too specific and not too broad. So yeah, we've got Friedman here. Nelson Rockefeller actually ran for president, or ran in the primary against Nixon. So we have a Republican governor here. She is discriminated against in favor of dope addicts and welfare cheats. Probably sounds familiar, right? We're getting to pretty relevant history, because the people that responded, like my parents' generation, they had seen so much in the 1960s with like the violence and protest and unrest, that a lot of people felt that way, that they're paying really high taxes in order for people that aren't working to get benefits. And again, you hear that same argument today, but this is why you hear that argument. Okay.
So what is that, like culture druggies, and then like people who fake disabilities kind of thing?
And the other thing that's been in more recent years, really since about 2000, was the immigrants, right? Illegal immigrants are benefiting. They're getting our tax dollars, which just isn't true. Unfortunately, that's just don't know why people think that. But so this is this woman, right, that says that she works every day. This is the silent majority. So when we start talking about the silent majority, it started during this time period. Nixon used it as a campaign slogan. And then they used it again, obviously, in the Trump campaign in 2016. Jerry Falwell is a TV evangelist that we'll learn about. So like the Billy Sunday of the 1920s and the fundamentalist movement, Jerry Falwell used the moral majority. So this religious, this more conservative view. And that was really in response to the sexual revolution, the counterculture, the hippies. It was kind of in response to that. So we've got Jerry Fuchs. So these are people, actually not Rockefeller, but like most of these are going to be pieces of like people that you're going to need to know just in general that we'll talk about in class. There's the party platform. So all of these, here's a homemaker that's saying stop the Equal Rights Amendment, okay? All of these documents are from the point of view of 1980s Republicans. And what it looks like is they are all like, this is an anti-feminist one, right? This one is talking about we're an embarrassment, humiliations, defeats, insults. So they're talking about, losing the Vietnam War. They're talking about the Nixon scandal. They're talking about Jimmy Carter and the Iranian hostage situation. And all of these things, we're probably going to end up writing this DBQ. Y'all are going to have a jump start on this one because this is a really good DBQ. I forgot how good this DBQ is. We'll probably do it in class maybe. But these are some of the documents that you would need to sort in order to organize that thesis. I didn't want to go this long. What questions do you have, or what do I need to still go over or do for you guys? Anything? Was that pretty good? Was that helpful, I hope?
Ms. Cruz, I got a question.
Yeah.
So I have a problem whenever I write DBQs about how I include textualization in the body paragraphs and like I'm trying to describe a document. And
Okay.
I was wondering like, how's a good way to differentiate like what goes in contextualization versus how I describe the documents without just putting everything from that paragraph in the body paragraphs?
Okay, so you can, and this we'll talk about this in next week's writing workshop, where historical contextualization, one of the ways that you can earn a point for the documents part on the rubric, does that make sense? Where it says explains, you know how like on the rubric, hold on. All right, well, I'm using yours as an example. So on the rubric, okay, this is how you use the documents, okay? And so for each document, you have to describe, explain, support your thesis statement. So that's what your question is, right? For the documents, you want to provide historical, the H in the HIP, correct? Is that what you're saying? Okay, so that is a way that you can do that. For every document, you can provide historical context. So for example, if we are looking at, what's the best one? All right, this was a really good one that a lot of students did. The National, where is it? Okay, the National Defense and Education Act one. Do you remember that one for the Cold War DBQ? Where it was like, hey, we need to invest in our education and STEM and all of that, okay? So for that document, if you talked about the United States was feeling like they were behind because of Sputnik, right? And we felt like we needed to, we competed in the space race and this arms race to like show that we were superior over the communists. That is historical context for that document, okay? That would earn you the explains point because it's the H in the HIP. And as long as you do that, you don't need to do anything about point of view or purpose or anything else because you have already earned that point. So I have some students where their strategy is, I'm just going to provide some context for each of these documents, right? Before I talk about the document, you know, or frame it in a way that supports my thesis statement, I'm just going to tell them what I know about the National Defense and Education Act. I'm going to tell them what I know about the interstate highway system Or I'm going to tell them why there was the House of Un-American Activities. And you could totally do that. And you would just be like, ding, ding, ding. Does that make sense? And so that's why I like it with the introductory paragraph. That's why I like to teach kids to talk about, like, for that women one, right? Don't talk about women between 1945 and 1960 in your intro. Talk about women beforehand so that you can save the historical context for, like, the documents like Title IX or for Roe v. Wade. Save that context and that SFI for in the meat of your essay, because you can score more points that way. Is that what your question was asking? Okay, good question. Hopefully that helped. But I'm going to talk way more about the documents next week. And it'll be just like this. We'll kind of like do examples, and I'll go over them, and I'll like highlight, like, this is how you get the describes, and this is how you get the explains, and this is how you get the supports. And I might even use like some of those DBQs, the ones that are the prompts that we looked at today. I'll find some documents that go with that. Does that sound good? All right. Any other questions or anything else I can help with today?